on deconstruction. So far we have covered the move in 20th century literary study between new criticism, which continues to have a fundamental impact on how scholars and students read and interpret literature, and structuralism, which also continues to affect the diagramming of genre, as well as the study of tropes, conventions, and norms not only in literary study but also in the study of popular culture, social media, film, and marketing/advertising. Though most literary scholars may not be composing straight close readings or developing account after account of a poetics of fiction anymore, the insights and even the limitations of these two isms nonetheless remain pretty fundamental in the study of literature, at least in English departments. But this past week, or let's say 2 weeks ago, a third party entered the fray. At the same time that structuralism was beginning to displace or to supplement new criticism in the United States, something called post-structuralism was already emerging, particularly in its most celebrated and reviled form, deconstruction. Or we might say deconstructive criticism. Right? Now, Parker, who is the author of our textbook, does a pretty good job summarizing the philosophical underpinnings of deconstruction as developed in the oeuvre of French philosopher Jacques Derrida, and the reception of that philosophy in literary study. But he does not really do all that well at outlining what a deconstructive literary criticism might look like, and that's what I want to do in maybe the next video. Or actually, no, in this video and the next video, sorry. He does offer, however, a sort of vague method of double reading as the method of a deconstructive approach to literature on page 90. So let's jump to page 90 and try to make sense of what he talks about here. Right, so page 90. He writes, deconstructionist interpretation frequently follows what has come to be called a double reading, or a two-stage reading. In the first stage, the critic identifies a confidently singular interpretation, free of multiplicity and deconstruction. I mean, these two sentences are a good example of how Parker, sometimes when he talks about deconstruction, is a bit clumsy, right? We get this tautology. Deconstructive literary criticism first sets up a reading that's free of deconstruction. It's like, well, that doesn't explain really anything, right? But he will clarify this in a second. Often, this first of two readings is an interpretation that a structuralist critic might propose. We see this in Miller, such as an argument about the overall system or perhaps a binary opposition or center that organizes the text into a stable, coherent system. We see this in Natalia Wright's article on Mrs. Dalloway. Skip a few sentences. Then, in the second stage, after setting up this first reading, the critic finds things that undermine the structure, things in the text itself that undermine the structure, things that, in deconstructionist lingo, break down the binary or explode the binary. I'm not sure this is really lingo, but he's not wrong. Or the critic finds a moment of undecidability. This is a word that Miller will use in the final paragraph of his chapter on Mrs. Dalloway, sometimes called an aporia, showing how the free play of the text's signifiers, its language, goes beyond the capacity of the system to confine it to one meaning or set of meanings. Okay? We'll see this in Miller. Let's read the next paragraph too. It is not hard to do a double reading, because we can always find something that troubles or breaks up the system. It is actually hard to do a double reading because, Parker here is presuming that people know how to do the first reading in order to do the second reading. But anyway, but he's right in this next sentence. It's hard to do a double reading well, because to do it well, you have to find something that troubles or breaks up the system in interesting ways. For that reason, if you want to set up a double reading or a deconstructive reading, Do not make your first reading so obviously unconvincing that it is easy to knock down. The more plausible your first reading, the more interesting your interpretation will grow when your second reading knocks the first reading over. Sometimes, instead of asking your reader to buy into your first reading and then blaming them for trusting you, you can tell them ahead of time that the first reading is provisional, a target that you will soon reconsider from a more critical and deconstructionist perspective. Okay, and then flip to bottom of 92, that last paragraph. To produce a deconstructionist reading, critics typically pick out part of a text, study its language, rhetoric, and figuration with great intensity, searching out ways that the text unravels its own assumptions and disseminates more meaning than it can unify, and more meaning than a simple structure can contain, or that a simple intention can contain, that meaning proliferates and disseminates beyond the bounds, not only of the structure, but also of the intention of its author. Indeed, if you want to formulate a formula for how to read deconstructively, then reread the previous sentence, so long as you keep in mind the ironic qualification that the idea of a formula, which Parker crosses out, is itself anti-deconstructive, bracketed under erasure. Deconstruction is thus like new criticism in the close attention it pays to a text, in that both, he just says it here, pursue a close attention to language, but deconstruction radically reverses new criticism through a fascination with disunity. Whereas new critics argued that the text fits together in organic balance and unity, deconstructionists might consider how a text can seem to fit together, but they end up showing how it breaks apart. Okay. So that last sentence is actually pretty good, but nevertheless, in some of these sentences, we do sort of see, especially when we looked at the specifics of Miller's article on Mrs. Dalloway, that Parker's description of deconstruction can sometimes be a bit clumsy and unhelpful. Right? But nevertheless, it might still be worthwhile investigating or testing this idea of a double reading with and against the specifics of Miller's book chapter. Okay, so turning to the Miller, you have a photocopy, but I have the actual book. Initially, Miller begins by pointing out what Woolf's novel shares with the tradition of English fiction. Right. So on page 176, Miller writes, about 2/3 of the way down the page, it might also be well to recognize, however, the strong connections of Woolf's work with the native traditions of English fiction. Far from constituting a break with these traditions, her novels are an extension of them. They explore further the implications of these conventions with Austen, Eliot, Trollope, and Thackeray, which those authors exploited as the given conditions of their craft. Such convention, it goes without saying, are elements of meaning. He sounds like a structuralist here, right? The most important themes of a given novel are likely to lie not in anything which is explicitly affirmed, but in significances generated by the way in which the story is told. So Miller here is saying he's going to pay attention to how the novel is arranged rather than to what is just explicitly said to us in the novel. Among the most important of those ways is Woolf's organizing of her novels around various forms of recurrence. And then in the next sentence we get, next two sentences, we get Miller's thesis statement here. Storytelling for Woolf is the repetition of the past in memory, both in the memory of the characters and in the memory of the narrator. Mrs. Dalloway is a brilliant exploration of the functioning of memory as a form of repetition. Yeah. So skip to the last paragraph of the book, so bottom of 201. Okay. Though Woolf deals with extreme spiritual situations, her work would hardly give support to a scheme of literary history which sees 20th century literature as more negative, more nihilistic, or more ambiguous than 19th century literature. The undecidability, there's the aporia, of Mrs. Dalloway lies in the impossibility of knowing as readers from the text whether the realm of union and death exists for Woolf only in the words or whether the words represent an extra-linguistic realm, which is really there for the characters, for the narrator, and for Woolf herself. Nevertheless, the possibility that the realm of death in real life, as in fiction, really exists, is more seriously entertained by Woolf than it is, for example, by Eliot, this is George Eliot, not T.S. Eliot, by Thackeray or by Hardy. The possibility that repetition in narrative is the representation of a transcendent spiritual realm of reconciliation and preservation, a realm of the perpetual resurrection of the dead, is more straightforwardly proposed by Virginia Woolf than by most of her predecessors in English fiction. Often when you want to get a sense of what an article is about, or a very difficult book chapter, it's really nice to read the first and last paragraphs, especially after you've read through the whole thing again, because you can go back to the beginning and ask yourself, wait, how did I get here? And then swoop back around to the end and say, okay, and try to see if the article nicely lines up in that way. Anyway, so we see Miller following through on this notion of repetition, which he mentions in the first paragraph. But we also note a few Derridian buzzwords in the last paragraph, like undecidability. We also see that he tries to distinguish Woolf in the last paragraph from the very tradition in which he situated her at the start. Sorry, I'm messing around with my books over here. I have too many books. Anyway, okay. So what is Miller's double reading? We might be able to extract it from these two paragraphs, but it might be better if we try to work through it a bit differently. What is Miller's double reading? Is there one here? Well, on the one hand, on the one hand, the form and the structure of the novel. For instance, its perspective, its technique of relating mind to mind, its images of trees, its doubling of Clarissa and Septimus, its theorization of time, etc., comprise a self-reflexive argument about fiction and narrative. Fiction as repetition, right? Fiction as the resurrection of the dead, as it were. Okay. So if we look at 186 and 188, 186 to 188, temporal placement. Okay, so we get here. Oh, 186. The temporal placement of Clarissa's experiences at Burton is equally ambiguous. The now of the sentence describing Clarissa's plunge, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, is the narrator's memory of Clarissa's memory of her childhood, home, brought back so vividly into Clarissa's mind that it becomes the present of her experience and of the reader's mind. The sentence opens the door to a flood of memories, which bring the faraway time back to her as a present within the complexity and fullness of immediate experience. Turn the page to 188. Woolf strategically manipulates in Mrs. Dalloway the ambiguities of this aspect of conventional storytelling to justify the power she ascribes to her characters of immediate access to their pasts. And so we see here that Miller is interested in attempting to make some kind of argument about how the very act of storytelling, of narrativizing in Mrs. Dalloway, is all about this repetition of the past in the present, taking advantage of this idea of a continuity within the minds of each character between the past and the present. Okay? And in that sense, narrative or fiction is the space in which the past or the dead can be resurrected and repeated. Yet near the end, and just a few pages after this, near the end of his book chapter, Miller argues that this interpretation of Woolf's novel is not possible without a further paradox that the novel leaves radically open. And we're going to work our way slowly toward that paradox by reading passages throughout the next several pages. So if you turn to page 191, okay. So last sentence of the paragraph at the top of the page. The power of narrative, not just to repeat the past, but to resurrect it in another form, is figured dramatically in the action of the novel. Continuity of each character with his own past, continuity in the shared past of all the important characters. These forms of communication are completed by the unusual degree of access the characters have in the present to one another's minds. So what Miller does here, we're working our way toward the paradox that I've anticipated. What Miller does here is show that his argument about how narrative in Mrs. Dalloway is a vessel for, or a space in which the past can repeat itself in the present, thus disclosing the continuity that the past and present share with each other. Miller is arguing that that continuity is dramatized in the lives of the characters in the novel too. It becomes part of the actual drama, not just the structure of how the story is told, but is actually in the story that's told as well. Insofar as the characters within one mind do not just have a continuity between present and past, but within the present itself, there is this odd and unusual continuity among the minds of the characters themselves, that suddenly one character will have a sort of continuous access to the mind of another character. We can argue that this actually isn't the case in Mrs. Dalloway, but let's just for now accept Miller's interpretation that is something that is going on here. Okay. Turn the page to 192. In the middle of the first full paragraph, the sentence that begins after the name Lady Bruton, the proper model for the relations among minds in Mrs. Dalloway is that of a perfect transparency of the minds of the characters to the mind of the narrator, but only a modified translucency, like glass frosted or fogged, between the mind of one character and the mind of another. Nevertheless, to the continuity between the present and the past, within the mind of a given character, there must be added a relative continuity from one mind to another in the present. And so, sort of what I just said. Miller here is being explicit about the various forms of continuity between minds, between the mind of the narrator and the character, continuity between past and present, and then a kind of relative continuity among the characters' minds, too. The next sentence is important. The characters in Mrs. Dalloway, this is part of the dramatization, are endowed with a desire to take possession of these continuities, to actualize them in the present. What does this mean? Turn to 194. The short paragraph near the top, an impulse to create a social situation which will bring into the open the usually hidden continuities of present with past, of person with the depths of himself, is shared by all the principal characters of Mrs. Dalloway. This universal desire makes one vector of spiritual forces within the novel, a general urge toward lifting up and bringing together. And so Miller is arguing that within Mrs. Dalloway, right, the repetition of the past in the present, in terms of just the structure of narrative itself, is dramatized in the lives of the characters as a desire to make the hidden continuities with the past, the hidden continuities that I share with other people, actualized into the present moment. And to do that by creating something here and now. The most obvious example of this in the novel is Clarissa Dalloway's party, right? The very end, where we see Clarissa, by arranging this party, actually arranging the past with the present, arranging a whole slew of characters into one room, right? Putting mind into a proximity with other minds, and even without even knowing it, brings Septimus Smith into her party by inviting William Bradshaw, right? So we see this convergence of continuities in that moment. And so in this, according to this reading, Mrs. Dalloway is all about resurrecting those lost continuities, resurrecting the dead through these creative projects of assembly, right? Of putting together a party, of composing a fantasy, and that this is the telos and the argument and the goal of the novel itself. Okay. That's the first reading. Okay, that's the first reading, if we're going back to Parker's idea of double reading. Right, Miller has up to 194, up to 195, well, at least up to 194 anyway, showed that this is the impulse of the novel. Right? One of the ways in which the novel is theorizing the repetition of the past within the present, both in the narrative structure, that is in how the story is told, but also in the drama itself, how it unfolds, the desires of the characters themselves. And then he writes on 196. The climax of Mrs. Dalloway is not Clarissa's party. So here he completely interrupts that idea, right? After a long paragraph about how characters actually fail to resurrect the past within the present, we get this: the climax of Mrs. Dalloway is not the party, but the moment when, having heard of the suicide of Septimus, Clarissa leaves her guests behind and goes alone into the little room where Lady Bruton has a few minutes earlier been talking to the Prime Minister about India. There she sees in the next house the old lady once more, this time going quietly to bed. She thinks about Septimus and recognizes how factitious all her attempt to assemble and to connect has been. Her withdrawal from her party suggests that she has, even in the midst of her guests, kept untouched the privacy of her soul. The still point from which one can recognize the hollowness of the social world and feel the attraction of the death everyone carries with him as his deepest reality. And boom goes the dynamite. Death is the place of true communion. There it is. There Miller topples the structure he set up in his first reading. Okay. In some sense, he's still arguing the same thing, that communion, that continuity is possible. But what makes that continuity possible is not the social projects of the characters in the novel, but something much more disturbing and deep and profound, right? Death. Death is the true communion. Let's finish that paragraph. Clarissa has been attempting the impossible, to bring the values of death into the daylight world of life. Septimus chose the right way. By killing himself, he preserved his integrity, plunged, holding his treasure. His link to the deep places where each man or woman is connected to every other man or woman. We all die, after all. For did he not in his madness hear his dead comrade Evans speaking to him from that region where all the dead dwell together? Communication is health, communication is happiness. Septimus, during his madness, expresses what is the highest goal for all the characters. But his suicide constitutes a recognition that communication cannot be attained except evanescently in life. The only repetition of the past that successfully repossesses it is the act of suicide. And then on 197, only by throwing it away can life be preserved. So here we can make sense of what's going on in that last paragraph then. That there, Miller's really playing around with that idea. If death is the true communion, that means resurrection is only possible by death. So what does that then do to our binary of life and death, of unity and discontinuity, of continuity and disunity, of the access that we have to each other? Right? Is this realm of death among the world of the living that he seems to be talking about here, and that Clarissa seems to be thinking about while she's alone wondering about Septimus? Miller asks in that last paragraph, does this realm only exist in words? Does it only exist in narrative as the repetition of the past, as the resurrection of the dead? Or is it actually a realm that exists in the world? And he says he doesn't answer that for us. He doesn't resolve it the way a new critic would. Instead, he leaves it radically open. It's undecidable. Woolf's novel does not answer that question for us. Right? Okay, so what do we learn by reading all of these moments in Miller's essay? These moments where we see the double reading, one that, projects of composition and arrangement that attempt ascendancy, attempt an affirmation of life, attempt the unveiling, as it were, of hidden continuities of the past with the present, of character with character. Right, that all of those fail, actually. That all those projects that the novel so strenuously, dramatizes and performs in its own narrative structure fail. And that actually what is the place of true communion in the novel at the very end is death. And so we see that whole structure that Miller has spent 20 pages setting up topple and fall over and become set into this, sorry, my hands probably look all crazy, set into this undecidable opposition or oscillation, right? So again, what do we learn by reading these moments? Namely that for Miller, Mrs. Dalloway dramatizes textuality. And what does this mean? For Derrida, a text is not inert. It is not simply an object that I study, as in New Criticism and Structuralism. It is an ongoing process of writing that undergoes shifts and redirections in the process of reading. Remember the root, or learn, the root of text as a word, which is related, after all, to textile, texture, textile, is a Latin word meaning woven, right? And is even related to textus, the Latin word textus meaning tissue or style. Its Germanic synonym, text's Germanic synonym, is actually the root of our word web. Right? So for Derrida, text and web are synonyms. Okay? And so when I approach a text, I get woven into that web. Right? I get woven into it. And for Miller, Woolf's text is not just is a text that self-consciously dramatizes the fact that narrative does this, right? Weaves us into it, right? Textuality for Derrida is thus the ongoing work of a text that involves me, of a web that attaches any meaning to other meanings, any significance to other significances that will, just like a narrative in Miller's argument, just like an attempt to construct or actualize a continuity in the present, create a difference. What does Miller mean that death is the place of true communion? For him, the novel insists that we can resurrect the past, but that we can only do so by throwing away. That is, by way of the losses and absences of the past that repeat themselves here and now in every present. It is there that we find communion in Mrs. Dalloway. For him, Woolf's novel is not just explained by the deconstructive idea of text, right? It models, theorizes, and dramatizes this deconstructive idea, thus anticipating the logic and tenets of deconstruction. In the next video, I'm going to slowly walk us through. We're going to stay very close to Miller, sort of, but we are going to wander a little bit into the ideas of Derrida and his position and his philosophy before swooping back around in the final video to a quick inventory of various techniques of deconstructive literary criticism that are at work in Miller's book and something you might actually try out in your own writing this semester.